Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about Rocket Lab again. I made a video a few months back talking about Rocket Lab. I showed off this model which was, full of different estimates. I wanted to go back, talk about the model again, reassess valuation, be realistic while also being somewhat conservative. And the reason for it, Rocket Lab is down below $4. When I last made a Rocket Lab video, it was hovering around $5 a share. It's dropped 20% since then, down to this $4 range. Is it worth buying? Let's explore that a little bit more. I haven't gone through and changed any of these yellow figures yet. The only thing that's changed since last time is I did fill in 2023 actuals. So last time the video was made prior to the full year being released, so there were some assumptions in there. Most of those assumptions came very close to being accurate just because we had most of the data. But yeah, we're going to go back through this time, change out these yellow ones and see how the valuation looks. So, Space Systems revenues. This is one where I have it growing at 15% and I have that growth growing over time. There are guidance numbers that Rocket Lab has put out that indicate that they expect somewhere around $65 million in revenue, $60 to $65 million in revenue. So if we do a 65 times 4, $260 million in revenue, assuming that there's going to be some growth, but 60 to 65 million in Q1. If it gets close to 260 or above, that's obviously much more than 15%, so I'm bumping this up to somewhere around 40%. I'm doing that because, 65 million times 4 is 260. If we went 40%, that strikes me as very conservative, because it's still coming in less than their current guidance, but there's also a lot of potential upside there, because Rocket Lab could come in at 260, 270, 280, maybe even 300 million on that Space Systems. That said though, I am planning on expanding this out a little bit more to 40, 40, 35, 35, and then keeping it at 20 for the remainder. So there's a lot of early growth here. As you get towards these later years though, I don't know where that growth is going to come from. There are probably areas, Rocket Lab is working on a lot of cool stuff. So these may be reflected upwards in time. But for now, I wanted to remain at least a little bit conservative, stick to their guidance right here for this year, and then keep that guidance sort of flowing, but shrinking a little bit as time goes on. Next one I wanted to take a look at is this gross profit. So it came in at 25% last year for Space Systems. I'm going to keep it around about 26%, bump this one to 27, and 28 right here. So the growth is still going up in this gross margin percentage. 26% falls again within that sort of like Q1 guidance. So we're definitely sticking to what Rocket Lab believe they can attain, and then hoping that the rest of the year they can sort of maintain that, if not exceed what we're putting down here, right? If they exceed it, that's good for investors. If they miss it, that's bad. If I'm overshooting this and saying 35%, they come in at 27, that's not a good thing. So, undershoot, always better. The 26% growing up to like 35% by 2030, these are fair margins for a company that's operating in, obviously, space. It's still hardware, it's still physical goods, so these are not going to be software-like margins, but if it was able to get to 35%, that would be absolutely fantastic. The launch services, this is all calculated from the below. I probably should have moved it above. It is fine. We know that Rocket Labs are trying to go for 22 launches this year, so I'm going to leave that put. What I need to change, though, is I had 5% growth in costs right here. They did come out and say that they're expecting around about $8.1 million in revenue per Electron launch this year, so I'm going to knock that back down to 2%. If you didn't watch the last video, the reason that this is 2% is just accounting for like inflation of just like natural price inflation, 2% per year, so I brought this one back to 2% as well. That's around about the 8.1 million they suggested. 22 launches. Don't expect any more or less than that. That's what they've said they're going to get this year. And then, of course, these costs coming down over time. Now, I do think there's a chance that this could come a lot lower, especially as they get towards reusability. And even more so if they can move launches outside the United States and get some of them going in New Zealand. Launching from New Zealand is a lot cheaper for Rocket Lab just because of fees and launching in different places. If they can launch more from New Zealand, you could see these costs per launch come down as low as $3 million, especially with reusability. But keeping it at $5 million, again, going back to what I said before and in the last video, if I am wrong on the expensive side here, if I'm saying that this is more expensive, that's better for investors, especially if the price that we get to in the valuation below comes out, saying, hey, it's worth $20 a share, and I'm wrong on this, and it actually ends up being $3 million a launch. That's much better for investors. So I'm going to stick to the 5 million. I think it's very conservative. It leaves almost 50% margin once they get towards 2030, which is great. Launch cadence, sticking with what Rocket Lab has said as well, where they expect Electron to get to a mid-30s level of cadence, and that would be sort of where it stays for the foreseeable future. And Neutron launches, the company is saying they maybe will launch this year still. I still don't believe it. So I've got 3 launches next year. The average revenue of $50 million is probably worth being a little bit less here. The first launch is supposed to be sold at a lower amount. So the average next year should probably be a little bit less, just in my opinion. And then they'll probably end up getting to that goal of around about $50 million per launch once things are running smoothly. And that's 2027 or 2026, apologies. Cost as well, they estimate 50% margins in the launch of Neutron. I will stick to that. I think it's very fair that these rockets will cost 25 million a piece. Of course, there's a lot of R&D going into it. That's not going to factor into the cost of a launch though, so sticking at 25 million as the cost of an actual launch. This one here, you know, maybe itself a little bit more expensive just as they get used to it. But I'm just going to keep very consistent here because we still don't have highly detailed information about the Neutron program. Obviously, we know there's a bigger rocket coming. It's going to compete with the Falcon 9. We know that it's bigger than Electron. We know that it's supposed to be coming this year. There's a lot of things that we do know, but we don't know a lot of things with certainty. Again, going around about a mid-30s cadence. This is slightly questionable because, well, it's competing with the Falcon 9. It's going to be competing with the likes of Starship and that sort of thing. Can it get to a mid-30s cadence? Maybe. Even more likely, I guess, if SpaceX do get rid of the Falcon 9 and just stick with Starship, then there's at least a market for Neutron. All future worries though, I'm just trying again to be conservative here in this. So that brings all these numbers down here where we've got total launches, 22 this year, 30 next year with the 27 Electrons, 3 Neutrons, come out with different gross profits and stuff like that. And then I did just want to bump these numbers up a tiny amount too. I'm happy with the R&D cost, but as you can see, I was fairly well off in terms of how much SG&A would drop. So I think that this is probably better served by being bumped up a little bit. It's like a 35, maybe like a 29%, a 20%, and then obviously slowly tapering off towards here. Still growing in monetary cost, but reducing as a percentage of overall costs. Last thing to change before we look at the valuation data is these shares outstanding. Should probably be 4% instead of 2%. Rocket Lab, in their guidance, said there'll probably be about 490 million shares outstanding at the end of Q1. So, stands to reason they're probably going to be issuing more shares throughout the year, so that gets that to around about 500 million by the end of the year. Still, profitability in 2027, which is great. On an earnings per share basis, heading towards profitability over the next few years. 2027 though is when this model has it actually getting there. Now we've talked about the free cash flow margin in previous sort of discussions. This is largely driven by how much similar companies in like the prime space, like a Lockheed Martin, a Northrop Grumman, that sort of stuff, how much their free cash flow margins are. So these are very fair values when you look at companies like that. Of course, Rocket Lab is sort of in uncharted territory. None of those companies launch rockets as frequently as Rocket Lab. SpaceX isn't public, so we don't really know this data for companies that launch rockets like Rocket Lab do. This could be much higher in time, it could be much lower, but trying again to remain conservative. So that gives us, I've got -30, -15, and then obviously trending upwards towards cash flow profitability in 2026. There's a chance that it happens in 2025, but I think that if you go with 2026, that's again a reasonable estimate. These numbers I did want to bring down though. This is much too high in my opinion. We maybe should have not done such high numbers last time. So trying to be like fair, we're going to do 20, 25, and 30 on the free cash flow. I just got to change out these formulas. You know, excuse me, I'm not an Excel wizard, so I have to do this. I assume it's probably much slower than an Excel wizard would do it. It does bring these numbers down at the end here. 20 price to earnings ratio is fine, but we probably want to bring these midpoints down to like a 27 and maybe like a 35. Again, and I think I said this last time, right, is there's a good chance that if Rocket Lab succeeds, it does trade at a premium because it would be it'd be a rocket launching company in 2030. That'd be somewhat like highly sought after kind of company. So there's a good chance it trades at a premium, but 7x sales, there's no chance. That is quite the premium, especially given that we're talking about 2030 here. It'd be quite mature at that point. So I'm going to do a 2, a 3, and a 4x sales down here for these numbers. 2, a 3, and a 4. So we drag all these out. And then what I'm looking at now is, what is a fair price for Rocket Lab in 2030, or what is the fair value if we take these different valuation metrics and multiples and just said, let's go with the midpoint, $19.61. That's at 25x free cash flow, 27x earnings, and 3x price to sales. That would be, you know, today's valuations, not that overvalued. That would be, you know, very reasonable, especially for a company that would be as high tech as Rocket Lab. So it'd be interesting. 1961 is, of course, if we went with the price that we just saw of 390, 19.61 divided by 390, a 5x return on your money. I know that some people watching this video are going to sort of scoff at that and say, oh, it should be much more. It should be much more than that. I'm expecting, you know, to buy the Hamptons with my returns on Rocket Lab. That's great. It can be much more than that. Like I said, I'm trying to be conservative and say, if this company succeeds in a conservative manner, what does that look like? And I did just want to end the video, of course, with there is every chance that Rocket Lab fails. There is definitely the chance that Electron is not required in the future. There's especially the chance that Neutron never launches and is never required in the future. And there's definitely the chance that SpaceX or similar companies step up more in this space system space and just really start taking, or probably not taking away at the growth of Rocket Lab, but really eating into these margins so that profitability is harder to come by. Rocket Lab is still a highly, highly risky investment. There is no guarantee that any of this happens. It's just, if Rocket Lab were to succeed, I think that this is probably a viable valuation of it. It could easily become a $20 stock. It could very much also easily become a $0 stock. So, you know, do your own due diligence. This is just my story that I choose to tell on Rocket Lab. If you have things that you think I'm missing, things that, you know, maybe I got wrong in this video, drop a comment below. Let me know what you think about it. I'd love to hear from people that are watching this video and your opinions, and yeah, understand others' thoughts on Rocket Labs. Drop a comment below. I'd love to read it. Thank you so much for watching, though. I hope you have a good one, and I'll see you next time.